All right, thank you for joining me, everyone. This is Chuck Morse, The Morse Force, Monday through Friday, 12 noon. My guest is E. Michael Jones. E. Michael Jones is the author of The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on World History. He's also the author of Degenerate Moderns and many other excellent books. Mike, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
You're welcome, Chuck.
Here, let me just put up your book for viewing here. Thank you very much. Mike, I'm already up to page 650. I'm at the part with the emancipation of Russian Jewry, and you're finally starting to talk about real Jews, which I think is interesting. And but yet it's a painful part of the book for me because I have some family that certainly was involved in that on my father's side. They were Russian Jewish revolutionaries, nobody prominent, but I just am familiar with this subject, and it's one of those things that is a very dark chapter in Jewish history, in my opinion, and it's something that Jews have never come to grips with. We've never owned it, unlike the Germans who have owned Nazism, and we have not looked at not only the fact, and the reason we haven't owned it is because there's still so many left-wing Jews who dominate Judaism and who've infiltrated Judaism.
Yeah.
So I want you to talk a little bit just about that, but we could go back to your basic thesis, which I reject, and that is that Judaism itself inherently is a revolutionary faith.
Yeah. The chapter on the Jews in Russia begins with Poland. Poland was the Paradisus Judaeorum. After the conversion campaign that took place during the 13th to the 15th century, all of the Jews had pretty much left Western Europe. They'd either converted or they'd moved to Poland. And Poland had a huge Jewish population, and they had their own courts, and they were happy there, I guess. That's why they call it the Jewish paradise. Mm-hmm. There were problems. There was the Chmielnicki uprising, which was caused by the Jews. Poland had reached its largest extent, and it never really got past the trauma of the Chmielnicki pogroms. What happened over the period of the 18th century is that Poland was divided, and it was divided among the three great empires that were around it. And the Polish Jews who were living in the eastern part of Poland suddenly found themselves in the western part of Russia. And this is where this story begins. Shortly after the partition, the Tsar is hearing stories about people in the Ukraine starving to death. How is this possible? He was wondering, because that was the best agricultural region in Europe. Hitler needed this in order to feed his population, which is why he went east in 1941.
Right.
So he sent a delegate there, and what's going on? Well, it turns out that the Ukrainian peasants are all in debt to the Jews. The Jews are taking the grain; they're making alcohol out of it. The peasants are in debt, and they can't seem to get out of debt, and they can't figure out why they're not getting out of debt. But the problem is that the grain is not being eaten; it's not being sold. It's just going into the coffers of the Jews, either in alcohol production or the money is going into usury. So at this point, the Tsar says, "Okay, we'll solve this problem. We'll teach the Jews how to work." All they know how to do at this point is usury or work from some type of alcohol, usury. They're the main things that the Jews are doing. We'll teach them how to work. So we'll buy them horses and plows and so on and so forth. It didn't work. As soon as the Jews got the horses and the plows, they sold them. They were good at trading. They weren't good at farming. And this is all covered in Solzhenitsyn's book, 200 Years Together, which has not been translated into English for some strange, it's not a strange reason. It's Rabbi Marvin Hier of the Simon Wiesenthal Center said, don't translate it, and the publishing industry didn't translate it. So what you had here is a group of people now that are not happy. They were happy in Poland. They're not happy in Russia. And so they're living in these shtetls. It's called the Pale of the Settlement. And they're on the western border now. Now, this is important because now they're confronted with the West. It's suddenly Prussia. There's no Poland anymore. It's suddenly Prussia is on the western border. Prussia is part of Germany, and Germany is the source of advanced ideas at this particular time. We're talking about the 19th century now. We're up to the 19th century. And Germany is the source of ideas like Hegel. And Hegel had a lot of disciples, and one of them was Karl Marx, who took basically Hegel's philosophy and turned it into his understanding of the dialectic as the way that spirit moved through history, and he turned it into dialectical materialism.
Right.
And this was the era of materialism. After the death of Hegel, all of Europe converted to materialism in one way or the other. And so this is a powerful force now, because what they're saying is that we can harness matter, use science, harness matter, overthrow the governments which are all oppressing us. They're all Christian governments. Here you have a group of people who is not Christian, have been at war with Christianity for over 1,000 years now. And here's a mechanism whereby we can overthrow this tyranny. And it spread through the Pale of the Settlement, through the shtetls there, like wildfire. So you have eventually you have two competing ideologies competing for the Jewish mind here. Communism, Marxism, socialism on the one hand. The ideas are coming in from the West, and they're finding resonance there. And a little bit later, you have Zionism. So you have a kind of Jewish internationalism, and you have a kind of Jewish nationalism. And at this point in time, it's the internationalism that wins out. Suddenly, you have all of these people, and this is part of the story that's really never been told. The whole rise of Jewish radicalism during the 19th century.
Exactly, and I agree with that. And it's one of those dark chapters, as I say, in Jewish history. I would point out that the Jews who became communists, and there were a lot more Jews that did than Christians, they left Judaism, even if they claimed otherwise. They no longer believed in God. They no longer believed in the moral and ethical precepts of the Torah and the Talmud. They no longer, Judaism itself is very conservative. It promotes conservative values. And these are people who left that under the conditions that you very accurately point out. I would suggest that most Jews living in the Pale of Settlement were not communists, but the ones that were the ones who worked in alliance with these corrupt Jews who were involved with grain business and alcohol and trade, etc. Most Jews were not involved in that, and it was not something that is inherently Jewish. But it is something that very, very brilliant Jews got involved in, and very prominently got involved in, and they were not well liked in Europe for that reason, because they were involved in this authoritarian, utopian, very messianic, atheist idea, transforming the world into a one-world ant colony, basically.
Right.
But you go into something more fundamental than this, in that you suggest that Judaism itself is revolutionary because we did not accept Jesus as the Messiah. We have a different conception of Messiah, and that our conception of Messiah is a one-world dictator, very similar to the Islamic conception, by the way, which is the world under Islam that leads to the Day of Judgment. And I understand that view. It's a traditional Christian view. It's a traditional Catholic view. But I would suggest that it's not true. That the Jewish conception, the Messiah in Judaism, is sort of a hybrid between the Christian idea of Jesus, which is a spiritual figure that is amazing and that improves in individuals' morals, and the Islamic idea, which is a military idea. Yes, the Jewish Messiah needs to establish a sovereign Jewish entity or state in Israel, that tiny swath of land between the Jordan River and the Great Sea, and from there lead the effort to build the temple, and that leads into a a messianic age where the Jewish people serve God as a kind of an extra layer of observance, that they are a priestly sect. And this isn't unique, by the way, to Jews. There are certain other groups that see themselves that way, including Armenians, apparently. But it's not, the Messiah doesn't come by means of a sword. It's not a conquest. It has to be that the Jewish people are spiritually ready for it. They're elevated for this. This is why in Israel today, you have a very orthodox sect, the Naturi Karta, that reject Zionism, not because they reject Zionism intrinsically, they don't, but they reject the modern Zionist movement, and I understand their position. I don't agree with it, but I understand it, because they don't feel that it is spiritually prepared to set the stage for the coming of the Messiah.
Yeah. I first of all, I'm not saying Judaism. I'm talking about Jews here.
Okay.
And I'm saying that what you have at this point is a competition for who speaks for the Jews. This is what's going on. So at the same time, let's say after 1848, the Revolution of 1848, Moses Hess wrote a book.
Yes.
Called Rome and Jerusalem.
Very heretical, by the way, and very controversial in Jewish circles.
Right. But the point I'm trying to make here is that he says the Jewish people have become their own Messiah,
which is complete heresy. He was a communist.
But Chuck, we're back to where we were with the previous program. You can't have heresy unless you've got a magisterium and a pope, and you don't have that. So what we're having here is all of these people rising up at some point or other, back to the pale of the settlement in Russia, being influenced by these new ideas and coming up with a new understanding of the Messiah. And Moses Hess was one of them. He was not he was left-wing. He was a refugee from the Revolution of 1848. He was disappointed in the result of the Revolution of 1848, and he started heading toward what eventually became Zionism. But at this point, he's saying we have a new idea of the Messiah, and it's more compatible with the world that we live in. And so what you're seeing over this period of history, I'm trying to describe, the whole point of this book is to try and describe the historical unfolding of all of these ideas of the Messiah that Jews have accepted over this period of time, or tried out and found wanting, and then they move on to another idea of the Messiah. And Moses Hess was certainly one of these people speaking to the Jews at that time about a new idea of the Messiah. I'm saying in the book, I trace it back to Shabbatai Zevi.
Oh, yes, okay? Absolutely.
Shabbatai Zevi was accepted as the Messiah by the overwhelming majority of Jews in Europe. They were selling property. They were heading off in boats to Turkey to be with the Messiah when he claimed his kingdom. It didn't turn out the way they hoped. The Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, became a Muslim, and then he said he was only kidding, and then it just got very confusing, and it was traumatic for the Jews. And I think at this point there was a split. There were some Jews, the majority of Jews in the shtetl just decided we're out of here. We're going to be Hasid. We're just going to be holy according to our understanding of it. We're going to withdraw from history. That set them up for another group of people who said, no, we're not going to withdraw from history. We're interested in history. Karl Marx has come up with an explanation of the movement of history, and we find this really interesting, and we're going to act on it. And that's what set up the whole Bolshevik takeover of Russia in 1917. They had tried throughout the 19th century. The Tsar and the Okhrana, the secret police, were having a very difficult time getting a hold of this revolutionary movement for one main reason, namely the shtetl. They could not penetrate the shtetl. And whenever the Jews would blow up something or assassinate some leader or other, the revolutionary Jews, they would return to the shtetl, and the Tsar simply could not find them. They could not reach. They had no reach. They had no intelligence there. And as a result, it was the Jewish shtetl that preserved the revolutionary movement throughout the 19th century, all the way up to the final Bolshevik takeover in 1917. Now, you say the Jews it's a sad moment and blah blah blah. We all know with hindsight that communism didn't turn out the way the communists said it was going to. But at the beginning, during the 1920s, for example, the Jews were bragging about Bolshevism. They thought it was a good idea.
A lot of them and you're right. I mean,
there were. This is Johannes Rogala von Bieberstein's book, Jüdischer Bolschewismus, which has not been translated into English, but basically he quotes one example after another, saying this is the fulfillment. This is the fulfillment of what we've been waiting for. An incredible sense of Jewish hope here that this movement was going to bring about a whole new world, and it's going to be a better world. Of course, that changed over time, but it was there.
You're right. It was there, and in a way, it still is there. It's a very corrupting element of Judaism that, it goes back. I trace it back to Shabtai Zvi and his very damaging claims to messiahship, which basically involved I would suggest that it was satanic. He took all the morals and ethics of the Torah and turned it on its head as a way to prove that he was the Messiah, as bizarre as that sounds. Having orgies in the synagogue, desecrating the Torah, proclaiming the name of God, which is forbidden, doing everything that you weren't supposed to do. I mean, it was a horrendous movement, and it did grab a large portion of the Jewish people, although not all. He was excommunicated by his own local rabbi. And that after he was revealed to be a fraud, the movement went underground as the Sabbateans and the Frankists, and they continued to do damage. It's a fascinating subject. Rabbi Marvin Antelman has written 2 books on the topic. I don't know if you've gotten a chance to see those. But
there are people that say that Sigmund Freud was inspired by Shabbatai.
I don't doubt that for a second.
There's a whole book on that topic, and I forgot that's in Libido Dominandi, but I've forgotten the title of the book. But basically, this was Freud's obsession with incest. Was his way of overturning all of these taboos and breaking through to some type of new liberated
new consciousness. I mean, Freud talked about polymorphous perversity, which is you can do anything with anyone at any time, that sex has no value, there's no attachment, there's no, sacredness to it. It's a complete, overturning the basic Judeo-Christian moral code. And, anyone who didn't agree with Freud was mentally ill, basically. I mean, they were suppressed.
Well, this got weaponized over this period of time. I'm just finishing a whole chapter on this in my new book on the Logos of history. But with someone like Wilhelm Reich, for example, who was a student of Sigmund Freud in Vienna at the time, it got weaponized.
Oh, yeah.
The book that he wrote was called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. He had to leave in a hurry, along with the Frankfurt School. They came over, they were promoting this kind of combination of Marx and Freud. Suddenly, we got to get out of town in a hurry. It's 1933. Someone's come to power in Germany. It doesn't like us. So they go to the United States, and they get picked up by the American Jewish Committee. And the American Jewish Committee takes all these guys and creates their whole project on the authoritarian personality.
Right, now, which was secret. The Americans was secretly authoritarian. I'd also point one of the major weaponizers is Wilhelm Wundt, a Protestant psychiatrist who literally brought psychiatry into the laboratory, and he started to tamper physically with people's brains, and that continued right up through the MK Ultra project, which was conducted by the U.S. CIA after World War II. So, this is, your history on that is quite right. And I do think there's a connection between that and Shabtai Zvi, because that movement went underground, and there was a civil war in Judaism for over 100 years to try to expose and excommunicate people who were part of this cult. But I do think that they did irreparable, possibly, damage to Judaism. They are still here. They are still predominant, and they are completely contrary to the Judaic covenant. Now, I want to just bring up another topic here, because you mentioned several movements in Christian history that you refer to as Judaizing movements, mainly Protestantism, Cromwellian Protestantism, the heresies against the Catholic Church, such as the Hussians in Bohemia and others. And it occurs to me that it's actually Catholicism that is Judaized. And I mean that in the very best sense. The Catholic Church became the new Judaism, at least in its own eyes, and it did in many ways. Rome became Jerusalem. The Pope is the high priest. The College of Cardinals is the Sanhedrin. The whole order of it and the embrace of the morals and ethics of the Torah, which Christians call the Old Testament. The structure, the hierarchy of it, the conservatism of it. But the problem is that Judaism could not do this like Catholicism did so successfully because we lost sovereignty in Israel. We had no state. The Catholic Church has a state, has a very large state. If you take a look at a medieval map of Europe, you can see that the Catholic Church literally, physically controlled about a quarter of Europe. And it had kings with armies. Judaism lost all of that. So in a sense, you made reference to the fact that we can't talk about heresy because we don't have a pope. And that's true in many ways. We don't really have a central authority except until now with the establishment of the State of Israel. But that's still very young, and it's hard to see in the long term what that's going to mean.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. The church it's not Judaism, but the church does call itself the New Israel.
Yeah,
and it's obviously a continuation of the promises that were made by the prophets during the time of the Old Testament. That's obvious.
Yep,
that's true. Okay, now you're leaving out a significant chunk of history, though, namely the first 300 years of Christianity, when Christianity had no state. And was a persecuted minority in the Roman Empire. Nero had a Jewish wife, and she didn't like the Christians, and they ended up in the Colosseum.
Right.
And the lions were eating them. And this was the exact opposite of having a state and the power of the state to go with it. Now, during this period of time, there was another element that got involved here, and that was the Greek element. Okay, Saint Paul was a Jew. St. Paul started out just to talk to other Jews. Every time he'd show up in a town, he'd go to a synagogue. And at a certain point, the Jews would not let him speak at synagogues anymore. Okay, it's over. The break is irrevocable. We're not going back, and so on and so forth. And Paul is now left in a situation where I guess I have to talk to Greeks. So I guess I'll go to Greece. And he goes to Athens. And he gives a speech before the Areopagus, which was the elite Platonic society, philosophical society. And he got up there and he said, basically, there's this new guy in history. He's concerned, and not only is concerned, he's angry at you, and he rose from the dead. And the Greeks look at each other and say, what the hell is this guy talking about? And they say to Paul, yeah, okay, we'll talk to you later. In other words, Paul failed completely. Here's a Jew. He does speak Greek, okay? That's in his favor. He grew up in Greek culture, but he can't speak to Greeks. Can't speak to them because he can't tell them Jewish stories because they don't know them and it doesn't mean anything to them. So you can't tell them it's the fulfillment of the prophet Isaiah. They don't know who that guy is anyway. And what I'm trying to say here is that I think this made a profound impression on St. John the Evangelist. He was in Ephesus. Paul was in Ephesus. I think he knew that Paul failed. And I think at this point he decided, we're going to have to speak to the Greeks. And so I'm writing the gospel in Greek. And that's when he came up with the concept of logos. The first four sentences are, in the beginning there was logos. Logos was with God. And God is logos. Now, if St. Paul had said that to the Areopagus, I think he wouldn't have gotten a different reception. Because what you're seeing here is basically these Jews who are now followers of Jesus Christ saying there's a new world out there. This is a new world, and we're going to reach out to the Greeks, and we're going to incorporate their way of thinking into our way of thinking. And so Christianity became a merger of Hebrew and Greek thought, and something completely new. And the vehicle that made this connection was him talking about Logos. In the beginning, there was Logos. Logos is God. If he had said that to the Greeks, I think the Greeks may have given him a more serious hearing than what he got. But I'm saying this is I agree with you. So in other words, I'm agreeing with you, but the point here is that there's more to it than that. And the other angle is that we had brought Greek philosophy together with Hebrew prophecy, and that's what Christianity is.
Well, I also think that Judaism was influenced by Greek philosophy, especially after Alexander the Great.
Absolute. Philo of Alexandria was a classic example of what we're talking about. What we're seeing with Philo, though, is an inability to take this beyond Plato. You see the same thing with Porphyry and Plotinus. Mm-hmm. This was the religion of the educated people of that day. It was called philosophy, and you contemplated eternal essences, and you rose up to the realm of transcendent forms. That was the goal of Platonic philosophy. Philo was a man who was trying to see how that was compatible with the Hebrew tradition that he had grown up with. It's not compatible. Ultimately, it's not, because the Messiah is different than raising to the forms on your own effort. The Messiah is the man who comes because you can't save yourself. That is the whole point of a Messiah. You can't do it. You can't do it on your own with your transcendental meditation or any other technique. You've got to admit that you need a Messiah. You need help from the outside. And so what happened is Logos came down in a way that no one other than the Jews could have expected.
Well,
and it caused a scandal in Greek philosophy, every bit as much as it caused a scandal among the Jews who refused, who had to either accept or reject the Messiah.
Well, you're talking about the brilliant ministry, of course, of Jesus, because he came down, according to Christian believers, as the Messiah, and that it was not like a military conquest. It was more that he would be sacrificed for the sins of man, and that it would open the doors to I suppose you'd say, Logos. I don't think. I think that Jews also have Logos. I think the Talmud incorporates that idea. In fact, the Talmudic approach has been one by which you have people debating issues in the same way that the Greeks did in the time of Socrates and Plato, where everything is sort of put out there and analyzed. And
you don't have to go to the Talmud. It's in Proverbs and it's in the Book of Wisdom. There's a clear reference to what the Greeks call Logos in those two books of the Old Testament. It's clear. That's clearly what we're talking about. It's just that the Greeks had the Hebrews had a much more concrete language. They did not have a philosophical language. And it broke in even before that, because we're talking about Moses. If you're talking about Moses, which is 1,300 years before Christ, okay, Moses is in the same situation that Paul was and John was. In other words, who are you? He says to God. And God says, this is out of the burning bush, God says, I am who am. Well, that's being. That's self-subsistent being. That is the language of the Greeks. It came into the Hebrews in a way that I don't think they understood. I don't think they understood what Moses said, what God said to Moses, until St. John said that Logos is God. Because they're saying the same thing. I am who am and Logos is God are really pretty much the same thing, but it's two different languages, and it took 1,300 years before you could bring these two languages together and come up with a coherent understanding of the nature of God, insofar as it's capable of being understood by the human mind.
Well, I mean, you're talking about, of course, the mystery of Sinai, which was witnessed by all of the children of Israel simultaneously, and which established a covenantal relationship between God and the children of Israel. That's one that exists today. That's one that was acknowledged by Jesus himself on several occasions, according to the Gospels, Book of Acts and Book of Matthew. Jesus said the covenant between God and the children of Israel is forever. and forever means forever. But I
Yeah,
point out,
you're now getting into one of the most neuralgic spots on the body of the Catholic Church right now. This is I did a show recently on it. I'm dealing with it in this other article I'm writing. But basically, in 1980, Pope John Paul II goes to the synagogue in Mainz and he says the covenant is eternally valid. Okay, now no pope had ever said this before, but the problem here is, which covenant are we talking about? There are many covenants
both
here.
covenants.
There is an Abrahamic covenant which includes everyone, not just all of the
Right,
children
all
of Abraham.
mankind.
Okay, there is a Mosaic covenant, which is what you're talking about right now. There is a
Noahide covenant, yeah.
Noahide covenant. So which one is he talking about? Well, we don't know. We don't know, and that has caused problems ever since. So what you've had now is basically 30 some years of the great minds of the Catholic Church, and I include Pope Benedict as one of them, trying to square the circle. What do I mean by that? Okay, on the one hand, 1980, Pope John Paul II says the covenant, not specifying which one, is eternally valid. And on the other hand, the Catholic Catechism says baptism is necessary for salvation. Now, how do you square those two things? How do you bring those two things together? Well, the Vatican wrote a document, 50 years of Catholic-Jewish dialogue, and they said, well, we can't. We don't know how to do it.
Look, Mike, that's a Christian question. I mean, as a Jew, I'm suggesting that the Jewish covenant, the Mosaic covenant, is forever. I'm pointing out that, in my opinion, that's what Jesus meant, but whether he meant it or not, that's a Jewish idea. We believe that the covenant, right, that is forever.
I agree that the Jews believe this.
Yes, okay.
But the question is, does the Catholic Church believe it?
Well,
and that's part of the crisis that the Catholic Church is going through right now, because they don't know how to square that circle.
Well, that's up to the Catholics to debate, and I would suggest and I don't mean to in any way intervene in Catholic issues here, but I would suggest that the Catholic covenant is as valid and that there's a dual covenant. I know that you don't, and that's an idea that is being discussed in Catholic circles. I know that we've talked about this in the past and you reject it, but, that's sort of, again, speaking as a non-Catholic who cares about the church and who wants to see the church's ship of state fly right, that seems to me to be what appears to be obvious, at least to me. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Talmud because you've mentioned in your book that there's some very offensive and unflattering comments in the Talmud about Jesus, and that you seem to suggest that invalidates the entire Talmud. I want to just say two things about that. First of all, the really unfortunate things said about Jesus was said in a book called Toledot Jeshu, which you also mentioned, and that book, it's a shame. I'm ashamed of that book, the fact that it was written, but it is not Talmud. It's not hagiography. It's nothing. It's not Jewish faith. It's just a book that happened to be written by a Jew, and that the comments in the Talmud, I would dispute those as being about Jesus. They were written by Onkelos, who was a Roman citizen who became a Jew, and before that he was a major religious pagan. And he was talking about his time in paganism when he made very anthropomorphic references to hell, which is not the way Jews understand hell. I would point out that at that time, and this was the first centuries of the Common Era, before Constantine, Judaism and Christianity were in a fierce battle. And there were unpleasant things said on both sides about each other. I mean, there are certain passages in the New Testament that are pretty anti-Semitic, in my opinion. And they were not consistent with Jewish belief. I mean, and I'll just tell what they were. In the book of Matthew was the comment that at the time that the Jewish authorities recommended that Jesus be executed to the Romans, which was a big mistake, admittedly, in looking back in history. The crowd said, "Let the blood of Jesus be on our heads and on every generation forever." That's completely un-Jewish. We're not, the sins of the father are not put on the heads of the sons and daughters. You know, yes, that's the other one I was going to mention. Right, right. Well, okay. Right. All right. Look, I mean, I understand. Yeah. Hmm. Well, no, I do defend it, and I think that the passages that you mentioned, I mean, I don't know. They might be in the Talmud or they might not. I haven't actually seen it in the Talmud, and there is a Talmud at my synagogue. It's a 16-volume book. I know it's a modern edition. Maybe it was edited out. I grant you. And it's the Babylonian Talmud. As you said, the Palestinian Talmud is a lot smaller. That's about two books. But my contention is that these really unflattering comments are probably in the Toledot Jeshu, and that the Jewish idea of hell is not an anthropomorphic idea. It's not something that's not how we view hell as a place like that. Now, as far as being anti-Semitic, look, I understand the difference between being anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. I mean, you could say that I'm anti-communist. That doesn't mean I don't like Russians. You know, it's a racial thing, this idea of anti-Semitism, and it is not Catholic. The Catholic Church might have been anti-Jewish, but it was religiously, anti-Jewish, and there you go. But it was not anti-Semitic. I'm making this point. Well, they didn't know. Well, actually, it came from the Spanish Inquisition, but maybe they didn't call it that yet. But there was a racial component to it, that Jews somehow biologically. There you go. That's right. Well, uh, and I understand, and I also would suggest that a lot of those conversions were not necessarily voluntary. I mean, there was a lot of coercion involved there. But the point I'm making is that the comment in the New Testament about the synagogue of Satan and that stuff, I would say that's anti-Semitic, because it's saying, or that the blood of the sin is on the generations, because it's saying that Jewish people biologically today are responsible for the decision to execute Jesus, and that is anti-Semitic. Good, so do I. All right, fine. All right. That's a point well taken. I guess you could say it was on both sides, because the idea that the Jews have inherited something, a sin, is just as racist. So you had this view out there, and it's both anti-Semitic and I suppose anti. Mhm. Mhm. All right. Look, I mean, we don't. I would suggest, and this is again my opinion, the Gospels were written, I think, about a century after Jesus was executed, and I think that at that time, with the kind of battle between the early church and Judaism, someone slipped that into the text. It was just a shot, and it was not. It really was not congruent with the way. First of all, historically, it was not likely, because Jews didn't think in those terms. I mean, it's one of those things that was put in there as a shot at the Jews. Now, as far as the Talmud goes, the Talmud is nothing more than commentary on the Torah. It is consistent with the Torah. It tries to understand the Torah and bring the Torah into practical function for everyday life, and it answers questions and moral and ethical questions that come up in the course of the life of the Jewish community. It is not inconsistent with the Torah. It's not a new religion. It continues the commentary that actually began before Jesus, It's something that goes back to the oral law, which actually goes back, according to Jewish tradition, to Sinai. So this was not the creation of a new religion. It was. Well, first of all, the temple had already been seriously corrupted before it was destroyed, and that Jews had existed without the temple during the Babylonian period. And what it did was it kind of replaces temple worship with things like the Kiddush on Friday night, on the Shabbat, with the wine and the bread. In a way, the Catholic Mass is a reenactment of this, by the way. It's, I mean, the Catholic Mass does the same thing, and it's well, I disagree with you on that, and I think that what it is it preserves the covenant until the temple is rebuilt, which is something that religious Jews pray happens every day. And and now Israel has been reestablished, which is a spiritual event in history as well as a political event. And the temple may very well become rebuilt. I hope it does at some point. I pray for that. I mean, it's so. But in the meantime, well, I'm not suggesting that they rush out and do it to. Yes, I did, and that's right. They tried to rebuild the temple. He asked for it to be rebuilt. There's also, and that's, I think he's a hero in Judaism, by the way. And so isn't, by the way, right after the fall, before the fall of the Byzantine, before Palestine was conquered by the Muslims, there was a rebellion, and one last gasp for the Jews to reestablish their state under Parthian sponsorship. And there was a leader of that rebellion, I think his name was Shimon Hizdai, who was seen as messianic and who was talking about rebuilding the temple. So this isn't new. I mean, this is a movement within Judaism to reestablish our state as God commands us to do, as he commanded Abraham to do and Moses to do, and to rebuild the temple. It's an ongoing part of Judaism. And it's something that in our lifetime very well could be fulfilled. That's right, but I think that we all have a hope that it does happen, because if it does, all right, never mind what you mean we Kimosabi. I get you. No, look, the point is, I think that Judaism and Christianity have a vested interest in trying to raise the spiritual level of Israel to the point where the temple could be rebuilt and we'll have a messianic age. Now, when the Messiah does come in Israel and he is on the Mount of Olives, the Israeli government will send out a little delegation and they'll say, "Welcome to our country. Is this your first visit, or are you here as a return?" Then we'll find out the mystery. Right. So. I don't believe that's what Islam represents, quite frankly. That's a whole different subject. I think they view it as perpetual war until they conquer the entire planet, and then the Mahdi will appear with Jesus as his prime minister, and they'll usher in the Day of Judgment. Um, yeah, but that was for your benefit, I think. Right. That all right. Well, first of all, when I say that I hope the temple's rebuilt, I'm not suggesting that somebody start a physical movement to do it. I'm suggesting that the way to do that is exactly the way the very ultra orthodox believe, and that is to raise, to be, to take the moral positions, to observe the Torah, to fulfill, to try to live a Jewish life, not to try, and then it'll happen. It's sort of more of a mystical thing. It's not. Well, but Rabbi Weiss also wants to see the destruction of the Israel. I mean, that's something that nothing will happen unless there's the state of Israel. That's what is commanded by. Well, that's horrendous, and he's completely out to lunch because Zionism is an integral part of Judaism, has been since the day of Abraham, when God told Abraham to go up to that land that he would show him. It has been a part of Judaism in every generation. It's something that every Jew prays for every day, that we return to Israel, that we return to Jerusalem, and that he is just, I mean, in that one sense, with due respect to him, he's out to lunch. I mean, if he thinks that look, I understand that there's a secular side of Zionism that is not, that is, it's political and it's not religious. I get that. But even if it isn't, they are still fulfilling a large part of the Torah just by being there. Even the most secular, atheist, communist Jew, when they are in Israel, they are fulfilling more of the Torah than Jews who are conservative and religious outside of Israel. So it's a de facto thing. This is what God commanded. Now, I don't know why it is commanded that way, but that's what the Torah, which you call the Old Testament, says. So it is a fulfillment of the Torah. That's what Zionism is. It's spiritual and political. You and I are going to have to differ. Well, Trotsky was a communist. I mean, it's Zionism is the national aspirations and spiritual aspirations of the Jewish people, and that Rabbi Weiss, what he means by that, and I can't speak for him, but I think I've seen enough of this. I've interviewed people of his ilk, is that they just feel that the modern Zionist movement is not religious enough. It's not elevated enough. It's not spiritual enough to bear the responsibility of creating a Jewish state. Now, that's a political difference. I disagree with them on that, but I understand it. And I get the fact that they probably aren't. Nevertheless, he prays every day for the restoration of Israel, because if he says the evening prayers. So, yeah, it's a strange thing. Judaism is filled with all these kinds of contradictions. Anyways, right. Well, and it's a brilliant book, and I recommend it. It's certainly one thing I've gotten a lot out of it from is just a study of the revolutionary faith, which of course is not Jewish in my opinion. It's actually I agree with Whittaker Chambers' observation when he says that communism is the world's second oldest religion. It goes back to the Garden of Eden. It's when Eve, the serpent who was Satan, said to Eve and Adam, "You can be like God. You can rule. You can know good and evil. You can, you can dethrone God in heaven." That's what communism is all about. And Judaism, along with Christianity, has been the bulwark standing against that. Now, Judaism has been thoroughly infiltrated. That is something that I'm trying to alert people to. And it started, I think, with Shabtai Zvi. But it's not the essence of Judaism. Judaism is a covenant between God and the people of children of Israel. Anyway, Michael, but please mention your book, mention your publishing house, and fascinating. I mean, I know that. No, and I'll check that one out. And I know that you seem to say that while communism is a Judaizing revolutionary influence, you also say the same thing about capitalism. And to an extent, that's true if you take a look at the internationalists like Jacob Schiff and others. And by the way, that was by no means unique to Judaism either, by the way. But I'll check that one out. That's really interesting to me. And E. Michael Jones, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. All right. Thanks a lot, Mike. Bye-bye.